In the last video, I argued that there's nothing syntactically problematic about reading Genesis 1:1 as a complete sentence. But even among those who interpret verse 1 as a complete sentence, there is disagreement about its function within the larger chapter. Usually, the verse has been understood to be talking about the first of God's creative acts. God created the heavens and the earth even before he created the light, the firmament, the dry land, the birds, and all the other things that are mentioned in verses 3 and following. But others, especially modern commentators, think that the first of God's creative acts is to be found not in verse 1 itself, but verse 3, where we're told about God creating light. They therefore understand verse 2 as the beginning of the creation narrative. Verse 1 they regard as a title or a summary statement for the whole creation narrative that ends in chapter 2, either in verse 3 or 4a. Most who interpret verse 2 like this, as the opening of the narrative, would also see verse 1 as a later interpolation. Four main arguments are usually cited for reading verse 1 as a title or summary statement. First, if the verse is taken as referring to the first of God's creative acts, this would make the narrative internally inconsistent, because in verses 6 through 8, we're told that God did not create the heavens until the second day, and in verses 9 through 13, we're told that God did not create the earth until the third day. This, by the way, was the main reason that Rashi cited for reading verse 1 as a dependent clause, but we'll talk more about that in the next video. Second, if verse 1 is taken as referring to the first act of God's creation, this would imply that God created a chaotic world, as we see from verse 2, where the earth is described as being without form and void, or as complete chaos, as the New Revised Standard Version renders the phrase. The notion that God created a chaotic world seems theologically problematic and possibly at odds with Isaiah 45, verse 18. Third, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 is thought to be parallel with Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, where the phrase Ele Toldot introduces a title for the narrative that follows. Fourth, if the creation narrative began not in verse 1, but verse 2, this would seem to fit better with other creation myths from the ancient Near East, such as the Enuma Elish and Atrahasis, which similarly begin with conditional statements describing the state of affairs before everything was reordered or reorganized by the gods. Right, so those are the arguments, but here's what I would say in response. First, I would suggest that Rashi's concerns here were exegetically misguided. For certain readers, especially for someone like Rashi or, say, a modern commentator who's been trained to analyze every detail of a given text or narrative, it may seem a bit clumsy for the author to have said that God created the heavens, Hashemayim, in verse 1, and then to tell us that God didn't actually make the firmament, which he called Shemayim, again, heavens, until the second day. And I would grant that if the biblical author had, in verse 1, stated only that God created the heavens, and then proceeded to write what he did in verses 6 through 8, verse 1 would indeed be difficult to read as referring to the first of God's creative acts. I myself, in that case, would probably be inclined to read verse 1 as a title. But that's not what he wrote in verse 1. He wrote that God created the heavens and the earth, and this is best taken as a merism for the entire world. You can see how that phrase is used in all of these verses here. You see, when the ancient Hebrews wanted to speak about what we would refer to as the universe, they would use this phrase, the heavens and the earth. So in verse 1, I think it would be exegetically misguided to interpret the terms the heavens and the earth atomistically, as if the author were treating these as two distinct creations. I just read verse 1 to mean that God created the entire world. Verse 2 could then be taken as describing what that world looked like at this initial stage in the creation process. Now, some who interpret Genesis 1:1 as a summary statement or title would grant that this phrase, the heavens and the earth, is a merism for the entire world, but they would say that it refers to the cosmos, that is, the finished or fully organized world. I think this reads more into the phrase than is warranted, though. When biblical writers paired the heavens and the earth, they typically had in mind the polar distance between these two locations, the heavens being the region above and the earth the region below. So I would just understand verse 1 to be saying, in the beginning, God created the whole world, top to bottom. We don't have to understand this phrase, the heavens and the earth, here in verse 1, as referring to the world in its fully finished or fully organized and arranged state. This is inferable not just from the narrative that follows, which I'm not going to appeal to that here because that would really beg the question, but it's inferable also, I think, from chapter 2, verse 1, where we're told that after day 6, the heavens and the earth were finished, vaikulu, and their hosts, vekol tseva'am, a phrase that alludes to the sun, moon, and stars, as well as the plants, animals, and humans that populate the various domains of creation. Chapter 2, verse 1, arguably recalls what had been said in chapter 1, verse 1. This is typically characterized by commentators as an inclusio, and it may be an inclusio of sorts, but the phrasing is very different from what we're told in verse 1. So I think something else is going on. The difference in phrasing seems to draw a contrast between the heavens and the earth in their finished state at the end of the 6th day, and the heavens and the earth in their unfinished state at the beginning of creation. At the beginning of creation, the heavens and the earth had been created, but they weren't finished yet because they hadn't been populated with all of their hosts. Now, don't take this merism thing too far. With some idiomatic expressions, the individual terms lose their original meanings entirely. For example, if I say that I'm under the weather, I'm not talking about the weather at all. Or if I say that I'm committed through thick and thin, it's not going to help you to understand me if you just go and look up what thick means and what thin means. The merism in Genesis 1:1 isn't this kind of idiom. The terms hashamayim, the heavens, and haaretz, the earth, don't lose all of their independent meaning just because they're being used in an idiomatic expression. The heavens can still be taken as referring to the region above, and the earth as referring to the region below. At the same time, however, both terms should, in my opinion, be understood qualifiedly in view of what we're told in the succeeding narrative. We learn from verses 6 through 8 that it was not until the 2nd day that God created the rakia, or the firmament. And this only happened after he had separated the upper waters from the lower ones. We can infer, therefore, that prior to this, all of the waters were still upon the face of the earth, covering the land completely with a deep, watery abyss, referred to in Hebrew as tehom. The heavens in verse 1 can therefore be understood as referring just to the upper regions, without the upper waters or the firmament. Likewise, haaretz, the earth, in verse 1, needs to be understood a bit differently than in verses 10 through 12. Verse 2 tells us that the earth was covered in water. In verse 10, however, we're told that God caused the dry land, yabashah, to appear, and that he called this dry land earth, eretz, same word. This happened on the 3rd day, after God had separated the upper and the lower waters on the 2nd day, and after he had commanded the lower waters to be gathered into one place on the 3rd day. Even if we ignore verse 1, then, it's still the case that earth, eretz, is used in at least 2 different ways in this chapter. In fact, in verses 26 and 28, the term is likely used in another sense to speak about not just the dry land, but the sky and the sea as well. So when I say that the terms heavens and earth are being used a bit differently in verse 1 than elsewhere in the chapter, I'm not playing fast and loose with the text. I'm actually trying to let the author himself define what these terms mean, because he doesn't use them in the same ways. Given that a submerged region can be referred to in verse 2 as the earth, I don't see why that term can't be understood in the same way in verse 1. It seems clear to me, therefore, from the text itself, that what God created in verse 1, at the very outset of creation, wasn't the exact same thing that's described at the end of creation, in chapter 2, verse 1. The earth at the outset of creation was basically a vast ocean with no dry land and no life. And so I would argue that as long as we appreciate the different ways that terms like heavens and earth are being used at different points in this chapter, there's nothing internally inconsistent about understanding verse 1 as referring to the first act of God's creation. When we're told here that God created the heavens and the earth, this is not talking about the heavens and the earth in their finished or fully organized states. Another approach to this text has been recently advocated by Nathan J. Chambers. He argues that the heavens and the earth in verse 1 refers to a bipartite world. That is, the realm of God and other heavenly beings like angels on the one hand, and the material realm, that is, the land, the sea, and the sky on the other. He proposes that we understand Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through 3 like this. Initially, God created a realm for himself and a realm for his creatures, but the creaturely realm was desolate and empty, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the breath of God hovered over the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Now, I'm not going to interact too much with his arguments in this video, but here's the monograph if anyone wants to look into them a bit further. Basically, Chambers argues that the bipartite structuring of the world in chapter 1, verse 1 and chapter 2, verse 1 suggests that the author had something different in view here than in chapter 1, verse 2 and following, where a tripartite structure is assumed, with the earth divided up into the heavens, the earth, and the sea. I find Chambers' argument a bit too subtle. Moreover, on his reading, we should probably expect for the author to have said something about what sorts of things God created within his heavenly realm. Chambers says that none of that gets mentioned in Genesis 1 because the author is focused only on the realm in which human beings reside. I don't doubt that this is the author's focus, but then why mention the creation of God's realm at all? And why end the account in chapter 2, verse 1 with another bipartite reference to the heavens and the earth, if, indeed, the heavens in this merism is supposed to refer to God's realm? On Chambers' reading, the reference here to all their hosts refers not just to the celestial bodies, like the sun, the moon, and the stars, but to God's angelic hosts. Since nothing is said in chapter 1 about angels, however, I can't find any exegetical basis for thinking that the author is referring to them in chapter 2, verse 1. The reader can always speculate about God having created a heavenly abode for himself, complete with angels and all the rest, prior to the creation that's described in Genesis 1. I don't think that a traditional reading would preclude the earlier creation of another realm. Verse 1 is concerned with the origin of the material realm, the earth and sky, and the origin of the sun, moon, stars, plants, animals, birds, humans, and so on. It's not concerned with God's heavenly abode, with angels, cherubim, and all the rest. Again, there's just nothing that I can find in the text that speaks to those types of issues. Now, I don't want to suggest that I find Chambers' whole monograph unconvincing. There's a lot of other stuff in his work that I very much agree with. For example, he argues that chapter 1, verse 1 is best construed as an independent clause. I also agree with him that the verse is talking about God's first act of creation. But to my mind, it's much simpler to understand chapter 1, verse 1 as talking about just the material world, not God's heavenly abode. The second objection to the traditional reading assumes that the Hebrew phrase tohu vavohu in verse 2 describes the earth as being in a chaotic or disorganized state. This interpretation is not philologically grounded, however. As I'll explain in a subsequent video, the phrase just means something like empty and vacant, or uninhabited and desolate. There's no suggestion here about the earth being in a chaotic or disorganized state. We're just being told about what the earth was like before God filled it with the various things that are mentioned in verses 3 and following. In fact, there are several indications, even in verse 2, that the earth was already organized in certain ways, depending, of course, on what one means by organized. For more on this, see pages 105 to 112 of this article by Vern Poythress. Commentators sometimes quote Isaiah 45:18 as proof that Genesis 1:2 cannot be talking about an earth that God himself had created. The verse, which probably alludes to Genesis 1:1, states that God did not create it, the earth, a chaos. The term that's rendered chaos in these translations is tohu, the same word that's used in Genesis 1:2. Note, however, what the next line says. He formed it to be inhabited. This implies that tohu means something like uninhabited or empty, as most other translations render the term. The verse is therefore perfectly compatible with the view that Genesis 1:1 refers to God's first act of creation. God didn't create the world empty and uninhabited. Verses 3 through 31 tell us that he populated it with celestial bodies and with birds, vegetation, sea creatures, land animals, and human beings. To understand Genesis 1:1 as referring to the first of God's creative acts is compatible with the sentiment expressed in Isaiah 45:18 because in Genesis 1:1, creation isn't finished. We aren't told that God finished his work of creation until chapter 2, verse 1, and by that point, God had filled the earth with dry land, plants, animals, and lots of other things. Some commentators also argue that at an earlier stage in the development of the creation account of Genesis 1, a primeval battle between God and the forces of chaos had been narrated. Only at some later point did redactors suppress this story. According to this theory, verse 2 originally described the earth in a very chaotic state because of this primeval battle that had just occurred. The rest of the narrative in verses 3 and following would then have been designed to explain how God brought order out of all the chaos. In support of this theory, commentators seize upon the word tehom in verse 2. This word is usually translated as the deep, but some interpret it as a kind of depersonified or demythologized reference to Tiamat, the fearsome Mesopotamian goddess of the ocean. But I think this interpretation reads far more into the narrative than is philologically warranted. I can't get into that right now, but will do so in a subsequent video. Alright, so here's how I would paraphrase verses 1 and 2. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, at that stage, was entirely dark and desolate, because it didn't have any light, land, vegetation, animals, or humans. But the Spirit of God, the agent of life, was hovering over the deep waters. A third reason that's been offered for reading Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 as a title is its alleged parallel with Genesis chapter 2, verse 4. As the argument goes, in the beginning, Bereshit, is parallel to the phrase, these are the generations of, Ele Toldot, in Genesis chapter 2, verse 4. The latter phrase occurs repeatedly in the book of Genesis and always introduces a new section, functioning as a kind of colophon. The problem here should be pretty obvious. Ele Toldot is very different from Bereshit. Its formal difference means that there's no presumptive grounds for associating Genesis 1:1 with the Ele Toldot texts that occur elsewhere in the book of Genesis. Since these Ele Toldot texts all belong to the same formal category, there's prima facie reason to assume that they can all be interpreted in the same way, as colophons. But that can't be said about Genesis 1:1 because it shares no formal resemblance with those other Toldot texts. If it did, it would have presumably said, Ele Toldot Elohim. These are the generations or descendants of God. Moreover, I think a better argument could be made for seeing chapter 1 verse 1 as parallel with chapter 2 verse 4b, since Bereshit and Beyom are both temporal indicators. All right, and the last argument for reading verse 1 as a title or summary statement is that if the creation narrative began in verse 2, this would fit better with other creation myths from the ancient Near East. The words in Genesis chapter 1 verse 2 are often said to be parallel in some way with the opening lines of the Enuma Elish. In part, this is because both stories talk about the primeval conditions of the world before creation took place, and also because both associate the beginning of creation with water. But I don't find this argument very convincing. Given its very subject matter, any creation account is probably going to mention something about what the conditions of reality were like before creation happened. Moreover, the type of argument here seems to beg the question because we can't just assume that verse 2 is where the creation narrative originally began. If verse 1 is taken as the start of the narrative and as detailing the first of God's creative acts, then verse 2 would have to be understood as describing the earth that God had just created. It's not describing the earth's condition before God began to create. The Enuma Elish creation account would then have to be understood quite differently from the Genesis account because in the former, we aren't told where the waters came from. The narrator simply identifies them with the gods Apsu or Abzu, the god of fresh water, and Tiamat, the goddess of salt water. The other gods are then said to have been generated after Apsu and Tiamat had, quote, mingled their waters, that is, engaged in sexual union. So according to the Enuma Elish, creation is an outworking of the material world, not the handiwork of a god who is ontologically distinct from it. In this regard, we have reason to expect for the biblical author to have begun his story quite differently, since he did seem to conceive of God as being ontologically distinct from the material world. That's something that I think is implicit in the narrative. He's not identified, for example, with any material elements like water or fire, and he's not identified with any material objects like the sun, the moon, or the earth. In fact, we're told that he created all of these things. Moreover, there is nothing in the opening lines of the Enuma Elish that really corresponds thematically to Genesis 1:2. Nothing is said about the earth being dark and desolate, for example. In fact, we're told that the heavens and the earth didn't even exist yet. To characterize the opening lines of the Enuma Elish as being thematically parallel to Genesis 1:2, simply on the grounds that it makes a conditional statement, sounds a bit like a theory in search of evidence. The opening lines of this work don't mention anything about the creation of the heavens and the earth. That's not something that will be narrated until much later. Before that, we'll be told about how each of the gods was generated and how they became too noisy and how Apsu was bothered by all of this noise and planned to murder his own children, but was himself murdered by one of them before he was able to carry that out, and how Tiamat was infuriated by all of this and threatened to kill her children, but was herself finally defeated by Marduk. Only then, After Marduk had defeated Tiamat and split her corpse in two, are we told that he used the corpse to fashion the heavens and the earth. The Genesis account contains nothing comparable to any of this, not in its opening verses, nor at any other point in the chapter. Since the account is monotheistic, there's no explanation about which god gave birth to which. The one god's existence is simply taken for granted. There's also no story about a cosmic battle between God and some watery monster. Yes, water is mentioned in verse 2, but it's not personified, and it plays no active role in creation. No gods are generated through the mingling of its waters. The dry land emerges from the water in verses 9 through 10 because God separates the waters, and the sea creatures emerge from the waters in verses 20 through 23 because God commands it. When the Enuma Elish was first discovered and translated, academics in biblical studies departments were very excited because they finally possessed an extremely ancient cosmological myth from the same part of the world as the book of Genesis. In their enthusiasm, many commentators exaggerated the parallels between these two accounts. But nowadays, commentators are a bit more restrained. Few would still argue that the author of the creation account in Genesis borrowed directly from the Enuma Elish. Most would see the influence here as quite loose and indirect, but such a vague kind of influence is not very helpful from an exegetical standpoint. How does the exegete utilize one text to interpret another if the texts are only very loosely connected with one another in some vague and uncertain way? In fact, most of the themes and the general structure of these two ancient cosmogonies are very different, even if we only look at the opening lines of both accounts and ignore the first verse in the Genesis account. Okay, so that's what I would say about the alleged thematic parallels between these two ancient cosmogonies. And then, in terms of its literary structure, the Enuma Elish contains nothing comparable to Genesis 1:1. Well, I guess that's one of the reasons that they say that Genesis 1:1 was a later title. But then the Enuma Elish is really much more elaborate than what we have in Genesis chapter 1, verses 2 through 3. So I'm not seeing much of a parallel there either. I'll have more to say, though, about the grammatical structure of Genesis 1:1 through 3 and the Enuma Elish in the next video. For several reasons, then, I find the Enuma Elish unhelpful for assessing how either Genesis 1:1 or 1:2 is supposed to be read. Similar things can be said about Atrahasis. Few today would argue that the author of Genesis 1 was directly influenced by this work. And there's nothing said in this work's opening lines about the earth being covered in darkness and as having no inhabitants. Quite the opposite. The gods already exist, and so do heaven and earth. I would argue that there are other ancient creation myths that can be more aptly compared to the Genesis account. The opening lines of a myth titled Marduk, Creator of the World, give the impression that nothing existed prior to creation. We're told that there was no holy house. No house for the gods had been built in a pure place. No reed had come forth. No tree had been created. No city had been built. No settlement had been founded, and so on. And notice this line, the depths had not been built. That suggests that there wasn't even any water, something that sounds quite different from what we're told in other cosmogonic myths of the ancient Near East, not just those of Mesopotamia, but Egypt as well. Okay, but then we're told all the world was sea. The spring in the midst of the sea was only a channel. So which is it? Did the sea exist or not? Well, some commentators have suggested that the text has gotten jumbled up somehow, and so they try to rearrange the lines a bit. Others just think that the account was poorly written. Plausibly, what the author originally said is that at first there was no water, but then water was created and it covered the whole world. That would sound a bit reminiscent of Genesis 1:2, don't you think? At any rate, in the next lines, we're told about how Babylon and its sacred temple at Esagila were built, although the author doesn't say who built it. Presumably it was Marduk. We are explicitly told that Marduk made the Anuna gods. He made them all as one, the author states. I'm not exactly sure what that means. Maybe the god made them to act as one collective body? Next we're told that, quote, Marduk tied together a raft on the face of the waters, and he created dirt and heaped it on the raft. So the dry land is envisaged as a raft floating on top of the waters. Then, quote, in order to settle the gods in a comfortable dwelling, he created mankind. But here, it's not just Marduk, but he and his female consort Aruru who create humankind. Aruru created the seed of humankind with him. Human beings are therefore the descendants of Marduk and his consort. Marduk is also said to have created the animals, as well as the Tigris and the Euphrates. These were, of course, the two most important rivers in Mesopotamia. And finally, Marduk is said to have created all the rest of the vegetation. So there are certainly a few noteworthy comparisons that one could draw between this ancient cosmogony and Genesis chapter 1. Like the god of Genesis 1, Marduk is envisaged as the sole creator, except in the case of humans. And another similarity with Genesis 1 is that Marduk isn't said to have utilized pre-existing material when he created the world. None of these comparisons provide us with grounds for thinking that Genesis 1:1 is a title, though. If anything, the comparisons provide some further grounds for reading Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 as describing the first act of God's creation, since we're apparently led to believe that nothing existed before Marduk began to create. There's also another creation account from the ancient Near East that's worth mentioning here, because its opening line reads a lot like Genesis 1:1, not 1:2. The theogony of Dunu, alternatively known as the myth of the plow, is an elaborate story about primeval kings being overthrown and murdered by their children. The story is narrated in cosmic terms. So, for example, one royal descendant, Sumukan, is apparently the personification of wild beasts. He marries the sea and begets Gayu, the personification of the cattle. Gayu slays his father, sleeps with his mother the sea, and begets another Gayu who marries Ida, the personification of the rivers, and so on. There's not a lot of character development that goes on in this story, just a rushed account of incest and parricide. The key thing to note, though, is the opening line of this work. In the beginning, Harab married Earth. Now, I haven't studied Akkadian, so I can't analyze the text as much as I'd like. But judging from the translation by William W. Hallow in the Context of Scripture volume, this phrase would seem to dovetail nicely with the traditional reading of Genesis 1, which understands Reshit as being in the absolute state, and the verse as narrated in the first of God's creative acts. The Akkadian is Ina Resh. The dictionary form of the second word here is Reshu, which is cognate with the Hebrew Rosh, which often translates as first or even beginning. It's not an exact equivalent of Reshit, but in the context where it appears in the myth of the plow, it would probably function as a virtual synonym. The text is pretty damaged, though, so it's possible that I'm just not understanding it correctly. Here are some other translations. Notice something else about this creation account. The sea doesn't exist before creation, but is of secondary origins. This is similar to the myth that we just looked at least if I'm interpreting it correctly. We're told that, with the plowing of their Harbu plows, they caused the creation of the sea. And note that the word for sea here is Tamtu, or Tiamtu, which is where we get the name Tiamat, and which is etymologically related to the Hebrew tehom. So this too would fit with the Genesis account if we read verse 1 not as a title, but as a description of God's first creative act, and then verse 2 as a description of the earth at that first stage of creation. My conclusion about all of these Mesopotamian creation accounts, then, is that none of them illustrates why Genesis 1:1 is best understood as a title or summary statement, and verse 2 as the opening verse in the narrative. The opening lines of the Enuma Elish and Atrahasis are thematically very different from Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. And the works known as Marduk, creator of the world, and the myth of the plow can possibly be adduced as evidence that Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 is best construed as the opening of the narrative. One last thing I'd like to add here is that it seems difficult on its face to read Genesis chapter 1, verse 2 as the opening words of the narrative, because in that case the narrative would start with, "And the earth was." That's not a good way to start a narrative. Typically, in ancient Hebrew, narratives either didn't start with a conjunction, as at the beginning of the book of Job, or the conjunction was used in a vav consecutive construction. For example, many narratives start with the phrase vayhi, which we could translate as, "and it came to pass." Now, I'm not saying that there weren't other ways to begin a narrative, but I think you'd be hard-pressed finding anything that looks like Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. Look here at the beginning of the book of Nehemiah. This seems like an especially good illustration since the narrative starts right after the book's title. And look, here's the vav consecutive, which is used to mark the start of the actual narrative. The only books in the Bible that begin with a vav that's not part of a vav consecutive are 1 Kings and Ezra. So stylistically, the phrase veha'aretz haita just seems like an unusual way to begin a narrative. We would expect it to read Vathi ha'aretz. I think a better analogy for us in our study of the creation narrative in Genesis 1 is Daniel chapter 1, verse 1. This verse isn't a title, and it starts with a temporal phrase, just like Genesis 1:1. And that temporal phrase also begins with the preposition bet, as at Genesis 1:1. And notice that the prepositional phrase isn't part of a dependent clause either. It's part of the main sentence. That again is how Genesis 1:1 has been traditionally construed. All right, in the next video, we'll consider the arguments for understanding Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 as a dependent clause. Thanks for watching.